Hello, I'm Ted Gamble, Chair of the British Architectural Library Trust. The Trust is a nonprofit entity that supports the extraordinary library and collections of the Royal Institute of British Architects. This is the third in our 2024 lecture series, focusing on the development of social housing in Britain. The topic for today's lecture is social housing in Britain between the wars. Our speaker today is Dr. Simon Pepper, an architect, architectural historian, and professor of architecture at the University. Edited numerous books and articles. He's also contributed to many respected books on housing, including High Social Housing in London, 1940 to 1970, and the beginnings of high-rise social housing in the long 1940s, the case of the LCC and Woodbury Down Estate. The interlocutor for today's lecture is Andrew Saint, the noted architectural historian and general editor of the Survey of London between 2006 and 2015. Andrew has lectured at the Department of Architecture at the University of Cambridge and at the Bartlett School of Architecture, University College, London. He has written numerous books, articles on architectural history, including Toward a Social Architecture, the Role of School Building in Post-War England, The Chronicles of London, and Architect and Engineer, a study in sibling rivalry. Following Simon's lecture, Andrew will join him for further questions and dialogue. And now it's my privilege to introduce Simon Pepper.
Good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are listening. Thank you very much for the invitation to contribute to this series. Thank you too to the earlier contributors, Rebecca Preston, who gave us an interesting introduction to the pioneers of Victorian social housing, and Andrew Saint, who spoke last about the early activities of the London County Council, which I'm going to abbreviate LCC. I should also thank a number of students who probably recognise their own individual projects in some of the remarks that I'm going to make. And finally, I should mention the I'm finding difficulty finding my screen. Yeah, finding. Mark, I'll begin that one again. Mark Swennerton is going to contribute the fourth lecture in this series. On the screen for my introductory remarks are some reminders of the past, some trailers for the future, and Mark's book, part of which I co-researched with him. I'm going to speak most of the time about the housing built by the LCC and by the City of Liverpool, both interestingly different, but chosen because I know more about them than the equally interesting histories of other cities. But we're also going to look at some developments during the First World War, which, as we shall see, shaped subsequent events. And we're going to finish with a glimpse at ideas formed during World War II, which present another point of change. One of my consistent themes is going to be the enormous scaling up of social housing activity after World War I. Between the two world wars, over 4 million new homes were built in Britain. About 1 in 4 by various social housing providers, chiefly the local government authorities, but 3 out of 4 were by the private sector, most but not all of them for owner occupation. And as a trailer for that idea, I've put on the screen Alan Jackson's splendid book about semi-detached London, which is as good as anything that's been written since 1973, when that one came out. The changes of pace led to enormous changes in tenure of houses. In 1914, 90% of the homes in Britain were occupied by tenants and paying rent to landlords, private landlords. Just under 10% were owned by the people who lived in them, and less than 1% by all the forms of social housing that we've heard about. so far. By 1939, nearly 1 in 10 homes was occupied by a local authority tenant. About 30% were now owned by the people who lived in them. The private rented sector had gone down very substantially. It wasn't going to disappear for many years to come, and it never has completely disappeared. But the direction of progress had been well and truly changed. Professional life had changed too for architects. The London County Council handbook lists 224 staff in 1912 to 13, the year before the First World War began. By 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, there were just below 900 regular staff listed under the architect of the LCC, and as many as 1,600 if one includes temporaries and other categories of worker also attributed to the architect, to the council.
Andrew, pardon my interruption. Have you attempted to share your screen already, or did you mean to do that a little bit later?
No, I'm meaning to show the 3 books on the screen already. And I'm just using that as a background for some introductory remarks.
We aren't really seeing it yet.
Yeah. So we've got substantial changes in the way houses are occupied, the way the profession is being occupied. What sparked all of this in the first place was a wartime crisis in housing. First, rent strikes, then rent controls were imposed to prevent the families of servicemen exploited, and to cope with the severe shortage of houses of defence industries. The government then began building houses themselves during the war, which immediately followed the First World War. A spectacular promise was made to build homes fit for heroes to live in. But it was the wartime programme that I'm going to begin with, because that set the architectural pattern for the future. The first of these wartime schemes was at Well Hall in the southeastern suburbs of London, close to the big arsenal at Woolwich, which had become an enormous munitions factory. It was built at enormous pace. The first houses being occupied within weeks of starting work, and by the end of the war, over 1,000 in place. You should be seeing the statistics in the top right-hand corner of the screen. It was put together by a team from His Majesty's Office of Works, the body that built police stations, government offices and things like that. And it made use of whatever available materials came to hand at a time when they were in short supply also. But it was done extraordinarily skillfully, an absolute masterpiece of picturesque design, which when pictures were released at the end of the war, obviously it was a security issue during the war, led many to suppose that this was going to be the future pattern of public housing in the country. But this was before they'd seen another important development on the border just on the Scottish side of the border with England, on the west coast, safe from intervention by the German Navy. The biggest explosives factory in the Western world was being constructed from 1915 to 17. Between 2 villages, Gretna and Eastrix. The factory itself occupied about 20 square miles because the plants were all separated for safety reasons. But altogether, 24,000 people, roughly at maximum occupancy, lived in the camps. The camps are shown in light tone. The permanent buildings is what we should be looking at, because this represented the other model for social housing in the 20s and the 30s. And department responsible, the Department of Explosive Supply, a direct subsidiary of the Ministry of Munitions, was headed by a certain Raymond Unwin, who will be familiar to many of you. He, with Barry Parker, was one of the chief architects for Letchworth Garden City, later Hampstead Garden Suburb. He joined the local government board as a town planning inspector in 1914 and was quickly seconded to work on the wartime programme. He then came back after the war as an important member of a committee that set the standards for housing between the two world wars. There couldn't be a more different picture. Instead of the picturesque Well Hall, we've got a severe, simplified set of buildings, simple roof lines, repetitive use of standard window frames, door openings, and things like that. And this, in fact, was much closer to the model that we'll see applied widely. The purest example of the new style was to be found at Dormanstown, a workers' factory built by the Norman Long Steel Company, using as their architects Adshead and Ramsey, with a certain Patrick Abercrombie working with them. These are names that will recur later in the story. They were using a system that the steel company saw both as a way of circumventing the great timber shortage of the war, but also as a possibility for non-traditional construction in the housing schemes that by now were promised to follow the war. You see in the bottom right-hand corner also an example of what someone once called the municipal Baroque layout, but which also picks up many of the ideas that Unwin and his colleagues from the Garden City movement had been developing. Large blocks with peripheral housing spread along it, but broken to perform interesting closes. And with the backlands at the bottoms of the gardens exploited by projecting cul-de-sacs, known as banjos because of the circular turning circle at the end of them. It's a fine example of the municipal Baroque. When you look at the recording of this programme later, we'll study more closely the house types themselves. But we're looking here at examples taken from Dormanstown, showing the two principal low-rise housing types of the interwar years. The parlour or B-type houses on the right, which had two living rooms, a front parlour, a back dining room, and a rudimentary kitchen, with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom upstairs, versus the non-parlour houses, which had a single living room, which also served as a kitchen. You can tell the wide spacing of the chimney breast, which accommodated a cooking range, a downstairs bathroom, which formed part of the scullery, and 3 bedrooms upstairs with no other services. Both types in this scheme had external WDs, and that varied, of course, with different places. But there's basically your 2 key types. And this drawing shows the extent of the wartime programme. And for anyone who's interested, gives you a guide to the publications, which I put together with Mark Swennerton many years ago to publish an architectural review. We'll turn now to London and the activities of the LCC. But first, a picture showing the LCC part of London. Today, we think of it as inner London. It's probably the part that American visitors will recognise. The City of London was a law unto itself in all senses of the term and did not form part of the LCC dominion. But the other boroughs had their own much smaller scale housing programmes. The total scope of the LCC's programme is shown on this map. You can see the LCC boundary, which is the wavy red line, much of it inside the 5 mile radius from Charing Cross. The yellow schemes are the big suburban housing estates, which were developed, most of them between the wars, but they include some of the small estates that Andrew showed you in his last presentation. The red spots are the inner tenement block estate, which the LCC built in large numbers and in a few cases on a very large scale, which we'll see in a moment. The biggest of them all was Becontree. This is a picture that's both true and untrue. It's a photograph, and it shows the systematic use of the simplified housing types extending over a vast area. The site as a whole covered 3,000 acres, 4 square miles, situated just outside the London County Council boundary in Essex, and rather inconveniently straddling through other local authority areas. And it was developed between 1921 and 1934 to house about 120,000 people in about 24,000 houses. That's rough 4 times bigger than the Garden City proposed by Ebenezer Howard at the end of the 19th century. Here's an early site plan showing the first few blocks which have been developed. And in a rather shadowy form, what looks like a very ambitious main highway system for the new town, involving a divided highway, 2 lanes each way, separated by a tramway system, and with frontage roads on each side for local traffic. We'll see the vestiges of that in the completed plan. But I've also concluded true drawings showing that actually not all the houses in Becontree are the same. One can produce many other examples. It was built over a lengthy period. The problem with Becontree was that it was developed with great commitment over a lengthy period of time, but with the services, the amenities, the shops, the schools, and above all the workplaces lagging far behind the house building construction itself. Other things lagged too. There were 3 rail tracks crossing the site, which were scheduled for electrification under the plan, which would have greatly increased the throughput of railway lines and made commuting for those who had to commute a much easier task. Things turned around in the early 30s when Ford opened a major factory in Dagenham and quickly accumulated a cluster of surrounding factories. There was one more thing that might be mentioned here. You'll see that an extension of the site led down to the River Thames, where a jetty was able to take barges carrying materials right close to the beginning of building operations. It had a bad press, it has to be said. Shortly before the site was technically finished, as a sociologist, Terence Young, did a study for a kind of social think tank and published a highly critical report and condemning it as monotonous, single-class ghetto, poorly served with amenities, all of which was true. If he'd come back 10 years later and seen it during the war, he would have probably got a very different impression. But this throws up just one of the problems that faced the architects and the town planners. Scale, the time it needs to establish everything else that makes a town beyond the roads and the houses. The LCC was also building in the inner city. The first post-war tenement block estate was at the Tabard's Garden estate, just south of the river in Southwark. Geoffrey House was something of a showpiece and an experiment. And there you get the multi-storey version of the simplified architecture. At the back, you see one of the experiments. It was the first elevator to be introduced into social housing anywhere in Britain. The LCC was actually thinking going higher than the 5 floors in these blocks. And the elevator was an experiment to see whether it was going to work. It was equipped with an attendant. They evidently didn't trust their own tenants. But the costs eventually persuaded them that it wasn't going to work on a large scale unless it was forced on them by very much higher buildings. But the LCC also attempted to tackle that other great problem of the authority attempting to replace slums, which was getting somewhere sufficiently large to move the very large numbers of people dehoused by slum clearance operations, which went into gear mainly in the 1930s. Here on the White City estate, built in the late 30s, you can see a development which isn't quite in the league of Becontree, but is still a very large housing estate, described as a new town in an old city. And which unusually got support from the media, which wasn't always supportive of the London County Council. What we've also got here is the beginnings of style experiments, the use of the horizontals from the access galleries to give it a slightly modernistic look. And in the top right-hand corner, a very modern looking axonometric cutaway drawing illustrating the modern flat. These were a small number of high-grade flats introduced at higher rents in their estates to try and cater for what you might call the officer class, school teachers, librarians, magistrates, doctors, dentists, and interestingly, police officers of the rank of sergeant or above, who were meant to provide a stiffening of authority figures in what otherwise might well be a single working class ghetto. The LCC also experimented dramatically with the most interesting of their experiments being these at OssulstonStreet, just next door to the British Library, for those of you who know central London. It began with a 9-storey block experiment tried out in 1925. And the experiment consisted of trying to offset the high costs of the social housing with various private sector activities, a commercial parking garage in the basement, shops and showrooms on the street level, a level of offices above that, 2 levels of private flats with a separate communal entrance, and then 5 floors of social housing with a flat roof and a play space area, all for the social housing tenants. It was revised dramatically after a visit to Vienna to see the social housing by the Austrian socialist regime. It kept the social stratification until the very last minute, when the scheme that you see built here was adapted downwards, reduced in height, didn't have any more lifts, didn't have the social and commercial mixing of the first experiments. But nevertheless, one of the more interesting remains from the LCC's activities. Flat lovers would always tell you that Leeds was the place to go to see modern flats, where the Quarry Hill development caught the headlines for a number of years, not always for the right reasons. Leeds was not actually a flat building city. Like most northern cities, they strongly favoured cottage estates on the peripheries of towns, which generally speaking weren't anywhere near as big as London. But this site was close to the centre of town, close to another sort of commercial rebuild, and on a sloping site, which meant that the blocks at one end were only 4 floors from the ground, while the blocks at the other were as high as 8 floors from the ground. Anything over 4 floors was developed using a staircase and lift system that served 2 flats at each level. And it was equipped with an exciting array of social facilities. But there were so many delays in the steel and precast concrete system that it only opened the first flats just on the eve of war, and the wartime restrictions and post-war austerity meant that most of the fancier social amenities did not get installed. But nonetheless, they claim to be the first multi-storey flat-served block of housing in the country. This would be bitterly rejected by people in London. And if you ask informed folk who the real capital of flat building was, it would be Liverpool, where the map of the city shows the same large red suburban estates built largely in the 20s, but also a cluster of very large inner city housing block estates, rising generally 5 floors from ground level, and designed in a fashion which was clearly aimed to impress as well as meet the modern standards. The flagship operation was the so-called St Andrew's Gardens, sometimes known locally as the Bull Ring. The horseshoe-shaped block does look a bit like a bull ring, but it also refers to the fact that the whole scheme was built on the stockyard and abattoir site in central Liverpool. It was opened to a fanfare in the late 30s, and it was the brainchild of Lancelot Kay, Director of Housing and City Architect, which I'd like to say more about, but there really isn't time to go into the life and times of one of the more innovative new public servant architects coming into play at this time. He was operating on an entirely different scale from the LCC, with a tiny workforce, supplemented by what today we'd call interns, bright students nominated by Professor Sir Charles Riley of the local Liverpool University Architecture School, who were responsible for many of the drawings and a number of the more interesting designs that came out of his office. Among them were a number of schemes for what they called clearing houses. These were to be high-rise blocks, 10 stories generally. The intention being to provide a central Liverpool base for those displaced by slum clearance operations on a temporary basis, from which they would move back when their replacement blocks had been built and housed in the vicinity of their original homes. This was an important and unusual character of Liverpool's building programme. An unusual alliance had formed here, which was very different. In London, there were strong advocates of cottage estates and equally strong advocates of high-rise building. Never the twain could agree. But in Liverpool, there was an unusual alliance of politicians across the spectrum, parish priests, Protestant and Catholic, small businessmen, large dock employers, who all wanted to preserve their flocks, their voter base, their customers, their workers within easy walking distance. And so the sort of overriding political social case for stability gave support for these ideas. None of them actually built, but again, it pointed the way towards the thoughts for the future. And so did the publicity that Liverpool produced for its schemes. Here you can see the posters used for housing exhibitions. The fact that they had a housing exhibition was itself interesting and stimulating, but clearly it was considered to be visually exciting in the way that their projects were presented. Liverpool had one other innovation I should mention before we return to London. As the World War II approached, a lot of the funding which was supporting the central area high blocks was withdrawn, and Liverpool adopted a fallback solution, which was to develop a new township in the southeast corner of their constituency, from which they hoped to exploit lessons learned in earlier operations like Becontree. There's the housing estate proper, which you can see with its geometry, but between the railroad and the new main highway was to be an industrial area, all planned, and already started just over here was a 20th century match factory, which had been beautifully conserved. Next door to it was going to be a new international airport, parts of which survive now. This was the brainchild of Lord Bramazon, whose Empire Airways flew gigantic seaplanes which could land on rivers and lakes throughout the empire, and were planned to land on the River Mersey just offshore here, and then transship the passengers for regular aircraft that would do their European connections. So there was an economic base. There was a plan, a rather ambitious plan, for a formal town centre, and then came the war. It was a different story from the story of Becontree. The war came just in time to stop all the interesting things happening in Speke, and post-war austerity prevented them from picking up in anything like as ambitious a way. And it's been many decades before the place really begins to achieve the sort of things that were dreamt about in the late 1930s. My last real example is going to be the flagship building of social housing. It's Kensal House in London, North Kensington, built by the Gas, Light and Coke Company. OssulstonStreet, which we saw next door to the British Library, was going to be an all-electric installation. This one was going to be all gas, because it was funded by the Gas, Light and Coke Company, the biggest gas producer in London. Neither of them were really green, because both electricity and gas were generated from coal-fired sources. But they were an attempt to combat the very great problem of domestic smoke pollution, which was particularly bad during the winter, but never really went away, because industry, railroad stations and so on produced an enormous amount of smoke, which, coupled with London fog, created extremely unhealthy smog conditions. But this scheme is drawn in a way that invites public understanding and delight. And it must have been a nice place to move into for the employees of the gas company. High-rise blocks, medium-rise blocks, a wide range of social facilities, shops, a hall which was shared with the outside community, and a primary school, nursery school, in the circular block that was built round where the previous gas holder had stood. It became a kind of icon for social housing in the city. And then came another war. In London and Liverpool, there was heavy bombing. It was fair to say that in the years just before the war, everyone expected the city to be almost razed to the ground. A lot of damage was done, and some areas were razed to the ground, but most of the city happily survived. But it did give the authorities a real chance to rethink their approach to the reconstruction operation that would follow the war. The London County Council commissioned Professor Abercrombie to work with them as a consultant, and mobilised a team which at its most comprised about 40, mainly architects, but some engineers, quantity surveyors, and other related professionals to think through the problems of reconstruction. Their thinking was assisted by the fact that a large number of people had left London during the Blitz. Some had returned, but many would not do so for a long time. And then just when they were coming back, another blitz of flying bombs and V2 rockets was to hit the city and cause another evacuation. So it was a bit of a seesaw operation. But what was clear was that reconstruction would happen. Question: was it to be cottages? Was it to be flats? What they actually came up with was a proposal for mixed development, a bit of both. And the paintings on the left, they're beautiful watercolors by the artist William Walcott, hired to illustrate the published version of the plan, which came out in 1943, showed a different kind of architecture. Even the cottages look different, but the duplex maisonette blocks rising to 10 floors with lifts were the highest parts of the scheme. And the point is that they were mixed together, high, low, and in many cases medium-rise blocks, all forming part of the same scheme, varying in their quantities according to the density that they wanted to achieve. And on the right-hand side of the screen is a picture of the what's now known as Churchill Gardens. It was a competition site organised by the City of Westminster for a site in Pimlico, just along from the old Tate Gallery, upstream from the Houses of Parliament, where a couple of recent graduates from the Architectural Association, Powell and Moyer, won a competition in 1946. The competition conditions and judging was done by Stanley Ramsey, one of the partners who'd built the Dormanstown scheme at the end of World War I. He was also closely associated with Patrick Abercrombie, the principal consultant to the plan. And you can see in this scheme for the Churchill Gardens estate as it became, a real life example of what the next steps in London social housing were likely to be. Which brings me to the end of my talk and a reminder that we've travelled all the way from World War I and the promises Homes for Heroes to the right-hand side of the screen, where we're planning for the future of the County of London, and in the middle, the iconic image picked up by J.M. Richards for his Pelican Book of 1940 as a sort of public reminder of what might be coming round the corner again. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, I think it's down to me. Am I audible to people?
You are audible, yes.
Good. Okay, Simon, thank you very, very much for a fascinating talk. Lots of things I certainly didn't know about, particularly about Liverpool, which is so good you put that stuff in, because I'm afraid I'm a bit too London-centered. And of course, wonderful to see that Leeds estate, which of course is no more, isn't it? Because in the end, that prefabricated system of steel construction more or less failed, I think.
Yeah, that's quite right. It was taken down about 30 years ago now, after deteriorating quite badly.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, of course, you were showing absolutely naturally and rightly, particularly in the latter half of your talk, some of the more radical and more interesting designs from Ossulston through the Liverpool stuff and so forth, and finally to the Maxwell Fry thing in Ladbroke Grove. It's true to say, isn't it, that all through the 20s and 30s, there was, as you emphasized at the beginning, there was a massive amount of this stuff going on, both tenements and cottage estates everywhere, and not just in London, Liverpool. I mean, Manchester, for instance, had a huge estate at Wythenshawe, didn't it? Massive.
yeah,
And
yeah.
they went mostly for cottage estates, did they? Manchester, for instance, I think they did, didn't they?
They did, and in fact, the Wythenshawe estate you mentioned is probably the closest rival to Becontree for sheer scale of housing. But it was cleverly designed. Barry Parker of the Unwin Parker partnership took a leading role in the shaping of Wythenshawe. And Sir Ernest Simon, who was both a local politician and a philanthropist in Manchester, took a great interest and contributed to a number of the social facilities that otherwise might not have happened in those days. So it turned out to be that they were able, because of that kind of sponsorship and the skill that was deployed, to produce really quite an interesting and commendable estate. Yeah, as I said at the beginning, there are lots of other cities, but I don't know them as well as London and Liverpool.
Because it was fascinating to be reminded, well, perhaps I didn't really know, that Becontree is 120,000. That's a big town, isn't it? It's a city, really. It's astonishing. And still, most people in London don't know it at all, really, even to this day. The curious thing about it, as you said, it had a very bad reputation in the kind of professional press to start with, didn't it? And was a bit rescued by Ford arriving. And there's been rather a lot of interest in more recently, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, no, yes, you are correct. It was certainly an initial bad press. It wasn't just the professional press or the social scientists. People in the East End of London who were being offered rehousing opportunities in Becontree often resisted it fiercely, even if it meant staying in very unhealthy and inadequate housing, because they saw it as distant. One town clerk from the East End described it as like being sent to Siberia. It cut you off from all the social networks that people on low incomes value very highly and significantly. And it was indeed true, as Terence Young found, that in the early days, the provision of amenities had lagged far behind the building programme, but it caught up. Exactly the same would be said about the new towns built after World War II. They were described as prairies, deserted. Newtown blues was a phrase much in vogue in the press in the 1950s. But the point you made is also correct. 120,000 is a lot bigger than most of the post-World War II new towns. It really was a massive undertaking, and it's rightly attracting interest now from scholars who are taking a new look at it.
Can you say, if we've got a little bit longer, a little bit more about the quality of these houses? You went back at Gretna, you showed us that some of the houses had a parlour and some didn't. And also mentioned that the LCC at White City tried to build some better houses on the top for the professional classes, or shall we say you call the officer class, I think. But if you take a place like Becontree, which is going on through a long period, I mean, is if you look at the internal plans of those houses, do they change during that period? Do they get better or worse? What can you really say, or is it impossible to generalize?
Well, I think it's fair to say more than one thing. First of all, the skills of the architectural teams involved were evolving. They weren't at all bad to begin with, and they had some good advice from some of the design advice that came out immediately following the First World War, hand in hand with the government subsidies that were helping these schemes happen. But all the local government authorities were forced by progressive belt tightening to alter the balance of housing stock. Just after the First World War, it was even considered in many places that you might have a majority of the higher grade parlour houses and a minority of the non-parlour houses. Those positions were reversed by the time you get to the 1930s. Parlour houses were only a small part of most estates, non-parlour houses a much larger proportion. Within those general categories, the LCC and many other places adopted what they called a normal standard, and then went up and down to cope with the full range of tenantry that they hoped would occupy these dwelling areas. In the block estates of the LCC, a number of lower level schemes were devised, some of them with shared bathrooms and toilets, open balconies instead of the walled-in ones that replaced those we looked at Tabard Gardens, were produced not just to save money, but to bring the rents within reach of some of the poorer tenants that they hope to be able to accommodate. But then if you were going to attract better tenants, you might have to offer something better too. And so they gradually introduced first staircase access instead of the gallery access, and then some really quite well thought out, distinctively modern flats that you could go into today and recognize them with a bit of redecoration and kitchen fittings as something that was perfectly mid-20th century in its quality. The actual building construction was, generally speaking, pretty good. We can all think of accidents and building scandals, but the sheer quality of the construction was generally really quite good. It stood the test of time, and it's likely to stand a lot longer.
Yeah, Becontree houses look a bit scruffy today, often, don't they? Unfortunately, but that's because people they buy them and they put in picture windows and things like that, don't they? And they don't much lose the front gardens anymore. I mean, the LCC, I believe, had prize schemes, didn't it, for cottage gardens in the front of that, and that I think all long got, hasn't it?
Yes, most of the authorities that I've looked at had what you just mentioned, the prizes for the best kept gardens, or in the flatted box, the best balcony flower arrangements. So there was that kind of care and support, and it's true that what our American listeners might not fully appreciate now is that these estates are mixed in a way that their originators could never have dreamed. So many of them took advantage of the Thatcher government's right to buy, that they've bought the ownership of their houses, and then done all sorts of things to them. Some of them very good, some of them not so good, but they're a good deal less simplistic and simplified than they ever were. Whether that's a good thing or not, I don't know. It's certainly a bit of self-expression.
And if we've got just time, is there? You talked a little bit about balcony access, and most of these Liverpool flats, were they balcony access with
Yes.
lift? Oh, yeah.
balcony access, the walk-ups to 5 floors would not have had lifts. The planned much higher blocks would all have had lifts. They made the breakthrough. There's no point in stretching a 5-story block, just making it 6. Why not go to 10 and get your real concentration of people for those temporary housing blocks that we saw illustrated, and which actually never got built. It was an interesting idea, and it just I put them in to show the sort of things people were thinking about as they grappled with rehousing low-income people in cities.
Simon, we have one question which I've been neglecting the chat box, I'm afraid, but Caroline Hamilton would like to know: was interwar social housing restricted to families, or was it available to one-person households too?
Initially and in practice, the overwhelming majority of them went to families, but the problem of the single person housing, what was that it was going to be expensive. The expensive parts of any housing project are the kitchens, the bathrooms, the main structures. All of that would be the same whether it was a family flat or a single person apartment. What the LCC did, and I believe this was replicated in other authorities, was to authorise a degree of subletting for single person lodgers. So if you had a 3-bedroom flat, there weren't very many of them, but were only using 2, you were allowed, with the permission of the housing committee, to have a lodger. There were some specifically lodger flats designed where a certain sort of washhand basin probably would have been provided in the room to give a degree of privacy to the lodger, who would share the other facilities in the apartment. But that was the kind of approach that would have been adopted in those days. The other exception, of course, would have been elderly people. The LCC, amongst its many responsibilities, took on what were once called the workhouses in 1929, and found themselves responsible for a large retired population, which they coped with, as well as a kind of pre-National Health Service hospital system which they ran. But that the ending of the rather cruel workhouse system and its replacement with something much more like old persons' homes was a feature of their activities after 1929, when the law was changed.
Interesting. We probably ought to stop now, but it was really great talk and very interesting discussion to hear a bit more about the plans of the flats and how people use them. I think that's all. Unless you want to add anything, Simon, thank you very much for.
No, I think I've probably spoken much too much already. Thank you.
Not at all. I'd like to thank both Simon and Andrew for what was a superb program, and one I certainly learned a great deal and appreciated. I'd like to remind everyone of the topic and date of the 4th and final lecture in this year's series. The lecture is entitled "The Fall and Rise of the Street in Post-War British Housing, 1945 to 1979," and it'll be presented by Mark Swennerton on Thursday, April 25th. Further information on the British Architectural Library Trust and its activities and programs, as well as other programming, can be found on our website, thebaltrust.org. Again, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.